You have everything. But something still feels missing. Why? We live in a world of endless choices, endless information, endless desires. From the moment we wake up, we are bombarded with ads, opinions, images of people smiling brighter, living bigger, achieving more, and whether we notice it or not, a silent voice begins whispering inside us, "You're not enough yet. You need more." So we chase promotions, likes, compliments, luxury, validation, status, control, and for a moment, just a flicker, we feel a rush, a spark of satisfaction, but then it fades. We feel restless again, we crave again, and we start the chase all over. Isn't it strange? We live in the most connected time in human history, yet loneliness has become an epidemic. We have more technology, more convenience, more comfort, yet anxiety, depression, and burnout are on the rise. We accumulate more, but we feel less. Why? Because we've bought into an illusion, a deeply rooted, culturally reinforced idea, that more will finally make us happy, that the next thing, the next job, the next gadget, the next version of ourselves, will complete us. But in Buddhism, this illusion is known clearly and simply, tanha, craving. It is the root of dukkha, suffering, and the more we feed it, the deeper the dissatisfaction becomes. 2,600 years ago, the Buddha saw the same pattern. He was born into a palace, surrounded by wealth, pleasures, and every form of comfort. Yet he left it all behind. Why? Because even with everything, he saw suffering, he saw sickness, aging, death, and the aching emptiness that no possession could fill. So he began to search, not outward, but inward, and what he discovered was profound. Happiness isn't found in having more. It's found in understanding more, understanding the mind, understanding craving, understanding impermanence. In modern life, we are taught to become successful, become attractive, become someone better than we are, but becoming is never ending. No matter how much we achieve, the finish line keeps moving. No matter how much we gain, it's never quite enough. There is always someone richer, prettier, smarter, faster, younger, luckier, and when we measure ourselves against the never-ending standard of more, we begin to shrink, our joy becomes conditional, our peace becomes delayed. We say, "I'll be happy when I get that house, when I lose 10 pounds, when I find love, when I finally fix myself." But the Buddha taught, there is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path. Let me tell you a story. A young executive once came to a Zen master. She had built a career, bought a dream home, traveled the world, yet she confessed, "I feel numb. I have everything, but I don't feel alive." The master poured her a cup of tea. He kept pouring and pouring. Tea spilled over the edge. "Stop," she said. "It's full." The master smiled. "Exactly. Your life is like this cup, too full to receive anything new. Empty it. Let go." Sometimes, we're so busy adding to our lives that we forget to notice the weight we're carrying. So what's the way out? Buddhism doesn't ask us to abandon the world. It doesn't say pleasure is evil or that success is wrong. It simply invites us to wake up, to see clearly, to recognize when our wants have become chains, to pause and ask, is this truly serving me, or am I just repeating the same craving in a different costume? It teaches us to live with awareness, not on autopilot, to return to the breath, to simplify, to see that joy doesn't need to be bought, chased, or built. It needs to be noticed. So here's where our journey begins, not with more, but with less, not with fixing ourselves, but with seeing ourselves, not with running forward, but with standing still, and looking around. You may be surprised to find that happiness was always nearby, in a warm cup of tea, in sunlight through the curtain, in a moment of stillness, when the world is quiet and your breath is soft. Simple things, but they hold the deepest truths. We spend so much time chasing happiness in the extraordinary, that we forget it's quietly waiting for us in the ordinary. Have you ever sat by a window on a quiet morning, and noticed the sunlight touching the floor? Have you ever heard the gentle rhythm of your own breath, or the sound of leaves whispering in the wind. These moments, simple, unremarkable, easy to miss, hold more joy than we realize. But in a world addicted to stimulation, we've forgotten how to see them. Modern life is loud, not just in sound, but in speed, in pressure, in constant doing. We scroll through dozens of posts in a minute. Jump from one task to another, check our phones between conversations. Meals, even moments of silence, we are always searching, but rarely arriving, always consuming, but rarely tasting, and in that rush, we overlook what's already here, the gentle beauty of a cup of tea, the joy of folding warm laundry, the calm in watching a candle flicker. In Buddhism, we learn that these are not meaningless chores, they are sacred invitations, to come home to the present moment. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "When you wash the dishes, wash the dishes. Not to finish quickly. Not to get to the next thing, but to be fully present in the act itself. Feel the warm water, the smooth surface of the plate, the rhythm of your breath as you move slowly. Gently." At first, it sounds strange. Who enjoys washing dishes? But try it, not as a task, but as a meditation. You may begin to feel something shift, a kind of quiet happiness, a peace that comes not from the result, but from the awareness itself. That is the gift of simplicity. There's a story about a young monk who lived in a remote monastery. Each morning, he would wake at dawn, sweep the courtyard, fetch water, prepare rice. Years later, when asked what he remembered most from his training, he said, "The sound of my broom brushing over stone." Not the chants. Not the teachings. Not the long meditations, but that sound, soft, steady, simple, because in that moment, he was alive, fully here, no need to prove, perform, or produce, just sweep. Just breathe. Just be. To feel happiness from the simplest things, we must relearn how to see, not with judgment. Not with labels, but with wonder, the way a child does. Have you ever watched a child with a puddle of water, or a piece of string, or a small insect crawling on the wall? They're not bored, they're fascinated, because they're fully there, with no agenda, no story, no filter. Buddhism invites us to return to that kind of seeing, to meet life without needing it to entertain us, to stop demanding that each moment be thrilling, and instead ask, what's already beautiful in this moment? Just as it is. You don't need a vacation to the mountains. To feel peace, sometimes, you only need to listen to rain on the roof. You don't need a 5-star meal to feel nourished. Sometimes, it's just warm soup on a cold evening. You don't need fireworks to feel joy. Sometimes, a smile from a stranger is enough. We often think happiness needs to be big, but real happiness is often small, soft, and humble. That's why we miss it. But once you start noticing, you start awakening. Here's a practice. Tomorrow morning, before you check your phone, do one thing. Sit, just sit, feel your body breathing, look around your room, notice one small thing you've never truly seen before. Maybe the pattern on your curtain, or the dust floating in a beam of light, or the silence that holds it all, and then, smile, not because life is perfect, but because this moment is enough. It's said that the Buddha often smiled quietly, not a smile of triumph, but of deep understanding. He had touched the freedom that comes when we stop running, when we stop complicating. When we stop needing life to be anything other than what it already is. That smile was born from the simplest realization: the present moment is full. And so are you. You don't need more. You just need to see more clearly. We are not burdened by the weight of life itself, but by what we refuse to release. There is a paradox in the human heart. We long for peace, yet we keep holding on. We crave joy, but we clutch pain like it's part of who we are. Why? Because letting go is hard. It feels like surrender, like loss. But in truth, letting go is one of the most powerful acts of love, love for your own soul. Imagine a small room filled with boxes, each box a memory, a regret, a fear, a need to prove something. You keep piling more inside: what people said about you, what you haven't achieved yet, the version of yourself you think you should be. Eventually, there's no space to move. No air. No light, even joy can't enter. This is how many of us live. We're so full of the past, that we don't know how to be present. We're so busy clinging to control, that we forget how to simply live. A Zen master once welcomed a student who wanted to learn about enlightenment. The student spoke endlessly of all he had read and studied. The master quietly began to pour tea into the student's cup, and kept pouring, until it overflowed. The student shouted, "Stop! The cup is full." The master replied, "Exactly. You are like this cup, full of your own opinions, beliefs, and stories. How can I teach you unless you first empty your cup?" This is not just a story about learning. It's about life. If we want peace, if we want lightness, if we want joy, we must make space. Letting go doesn't mean you forget. It doesn't mean you erase your story. It means you choose freedom over fixation. It means you open your hand instead of gripping tighter. Ask yourself gently, can I release this anger? Can I let go of needing to be right? Can I drop the story that I'm not enough? Can I stop comparing, competing, controlling? Because the tighter you hold, the more it hurts. But the moment you loosen, life breathes again. There's a story told in Thailand about a woman who lost her husband in an accident. For months, she carried his old rice bowl everywhere, refused to eat from anything else. It was her way of staying close to him. One day, a monk gently asked, "Is it the bowl you miss, or the love?" She wept, because in that moment, she saw clearly, she had been clinging to the object, but what she truly longed for was something the bowl could never give back. That night, she buried the bowl in the earth, and placed a lotus flower where it lay. That act, quiet, personal, sacred, was her first step toward healing. Letting go is often invisible, but within it lies the soft power of transformation. From a Buddhist lens, the root of suffering is attachment, clinging to things that change, trying to hold what cannot be held. The mind clings because it wants safety, it fears the unknown. It wants certainty, but life, by its nature, is impermanent. Everything rises and falls, comes and goes, appears and dissolves. When we fight this truth, we suffer. When we embrace it, we awaken. Here's a practice you can begin right now. Sit quietly, take a slow, deep breath, ask yourself, what am I holding on to? That no longer serves me. It could be a thought, a resentment, a fear. It could be perfectionism, or guilt, or old wounds. Imagine placing it in your hand, looking at it with compassion, and gently releasing it into the wind. You don't have to fix it, you just have to stop clinging to it, and you'll feel it, a lightness, a space, a breath you didn't know you were holding. A garden cannot grow in soil choked by weeds. Your heart cannot feel joy when it's packed with what no longer belongs. Letting go is like weeding your inner world. It's not always dramatic, sometimes, it's subtle, but each time you release something, you create space for something more nourishing to enter. Peace, clarity, joy. In the sutras, there's a moment when someone asks the Buddha deep questions about the afterlife, the universe, the soul. And the Buddha remains silent. Why? Because sometimes the answer is not in more knowledge, but in the stillness that follows surrender. Letting go isn't just emotional, it's spiritual. It's the moment you realize, I don't need to carry all this to be whole. The present moment is the only time where life truly happens. Everything else is memory or imagination. Once you've learned to let go, to release the old stories and quiet the inner noise, you'll notice something miraculous. There's space now, not just physical space, but mental space, emotional space, soul space. And in that space, something subtle begins to arise, a deeper awareness, a noticing, a return to this moment, to the now. Mindfulness isn't just meditation. It's not about sitting on a cushion for hours. Mindfulness is the simple, radical act of being fully present with whatever is happening, without judgment. It's the breath you feel, the warmth of a cup of tea, the sound of rain tapping the window, the texture of a word spoken gently. It's choosing to inhabit this very second completely, nothing more, nothing less. Think about the richest experiences you've had in life, holding a newborn's tiny fingers, watching the sun rise over the ocean, listening to someone you love laugh uncontrollably, sitting under the stars in complete silence. None of these require money, success, or perfection. They only require presence. Joy isn't in the event, it's in the attention. It's not in what happens, but in how deeply you're there for it. Mindfulness transforms ordinary moments into sacred ones. That's its quiet power, but we've been trained to leave the moment. To scroll instead of feel, to analyze instead of breathe, to plan for later, instead of live now. We eat while thinking about work, we walk while texting, we talk while checking notifications, we exist everywhere, except here. And this is why so many people feel like they're missing their lives, because they are. A young monk once asked his master, "Master, what is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The monk frowned. "But everyone eats and sleeps." The master smiled, "No. When people eat, they think about the past or future. When they sleep, they worry or dream. So they never truly eat. They never truly sleep." The master paused and whispered, "Enlightenment is doing one thing, fully, deeply, completely." In Buddhist tradition, the breath is often the doorway to presence. Why? Because it's always here. It doesn't belong to the past or future, it's the rhythm of now. Try this right now, just one full breath. Inhale slowly, feel the cool air entering your nose, feel your chest rise. Exhale slowly, feel your body soften. That breath, so simple, is a miracle, and if you were truly present for it, you were alive in a way that's rare in our busy world. You don't need to escape your life to be mindful, you don't need a retreat in the mountains or a silent monastery. You just need to return to what's already here. When you wash the dishes, feel the water, the warmth, the movement. When you sip your coffee, taste it as if it were the first cup. When you talk to someone, listen with your whole heart. Every moment is a doorway. Mindfulness isn't about doing more, it's about doing less, and being more. When you're present, you stop comparing, you stop chasing, you stop reliving and rehearsing. You finally arrive, and in that arrival, you see that life is already enough. The laughter of a child, the flicker of a candle, the sound of your own heartbeat. You realize, joy isn't hidden. It's just missed, and when you stop missing it, you begin to live richly, even in simplicity. Modern neuroscience confirms what ancient monks knew: mindfulness reduces stress, increases emotional resilience, improves focus and creativity, boosts happiness. It literally rewires the brain to live more fully, more peacefully. And it starts with a simple practice. Come back from the spiral of thoughts. Come back from the weight of tomorrow. Come back from the stories of not enough. Come back to this moment, because this moment is your life. Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh once said, "The present moment is filled with joy and happiness. If you are attentive, you will see it." Let that be your mantra. Every time your mind runs ahead, return. Every time you feel empty, return. Every time you forget what matters, return. Because returning is a sacred act, and presence is the gateway to peace. Gratitude turns what we have into enough, and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos into order, confusion into clarity. It makes sense of our past, brings peace for today, and creates a vision for tomorrow. Melody Beatty, after all the seeking, the chasing, the letting go, and the slowing down, there's still one truth we often miss: it's not what you have. It's how you see. You can have all the comforts, and still feel empty, or you can have very little, and feel overflowing. The difference isn't in the outer world, the difference is gratitude. We often think gratitude is something that happens after something good occurs, but in truth, grateful living is a way of seeing. A way of relating to life. You don't wait for joy to feel grateful, you feel grateful, and then joy comes. It's a shift from looking for what's missing, to seeing what's already here. There's a story of a blind man who had never seen the sunrise. Every morning, someone described it to him: the colors, the light, the way it warms the skin. One day, he said, "I cannot see it, but I can feel it on my face." And somehow, that's enough. To know that something so beautiful arrives each morning, even if unseen, makes my life feel full. That man lived with more wonder than most who could see. Gratitude is not about sight. It's about perception. Grateful living invites us to notice the unnoticed, the softness of your bed each night, the quiet kindness of a stranger, the fact that your heart beats, without being told. Celebrate the mundane, a meal with loved ones, a breeze on your face, a moment of laughter after a hard day. When we stop taking life for granted, we start taking it as granted, as a gift. Gratitude doesn't just feel good, it actually changes your brain. Studies have shown that a regular gratitude practice increases happiness by up to 25%, decreases depression and anxiety, improves sleep, resilience, and relationships. One simple act, like writing down 3 things you're grateful for daily, can rewire your brain to see beauty more easily. It's not magic. It's mindfulness in motion. In Buddhist teachings, dana, the practice of generosity, goes hand in hand with gratitude. Why? Because the more grateful you are, the more naturally you want to give, and the more you give, the more you realize how much you already have. Even the Buddha said, "Let us rise up and be thankful, for if we didn't learn a lot today, at least we learned a little. And if we didn't learn a little, at least we didn't get sick. And if we got sick, at least we didn't die." So, let us all be thankful. Gratitude in Buddhism is not optional, it's essential for awakening. You might ask, but what about the hard days? What about pain? Even then, especially then, gratitude is possible. Not gratitude for the pain, but gratitude within the pain, gratitude for what the pain teaches, gratitude for the chance to feel, to heal, gratitude that even in suffering, you are still alive, still here. As Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "When you are grateful to be alive, every breath becomes a miracle." Let's make this real. Every morning, before your phone, before the rush, pause, breathe, then ask, what is one thing, just one, I can feel grateful for right now? It might be the roof above your head, or the quiet, or simply the chance to begin again, and then see what shifts in your heart. A woman once shared how, after losing her job, she felt despair, but instead of spiraling, she began to write 1 gratitude note per day, to her friends, her old teachers, her barista, to her dog, to the tree outside her window. 30 days later, she still didn't have a job, but she had something else: peace, presence, a heart full of connection. And then the job came, but by then, she had already found what she really needed. Gratitude didn't change her circumstances, it changed her. When you live with gratitude, the world sparkles. You don't need new places, just new eyes. You don't need more time, just deeper attention. You don't need a perfect life, just the ability to see the perfection in small things. Grateful living is not a technique, it's a transformation of vision. Let's start with a truth that many refuse to see. We live in a world of excess, and yet, we suffer from a sense of emptiness. More food, less nourishment, more communication, less connection, more options, less clarity. We fill our homes, our schedules, our minds, but rarely do we fill our hearts. The paradox, we're told that fulfillment lies in getting more, but Buddhism teaches, it's in needing less. Simplicity is not deprivation, it is not renunciation out of fear. In Buddhism, simplicity is freedom, freedom from craving, clutter, and confusion. To live simply is to prioritize what matters, release what weighs you down, make space for what truly brings joy. It is an act of profound intelligence, and even deeper love. Remember, the Buddha was once a prince, he had palaces, pleasure, and power, but he gave it all up, not to suffer, but to find something real. He walked barefoot, ate 1 meal a day, slept under trees, and he smiled more deeply than any king. Why? Because he was no longer owned by the things he once owned. In his words, contentment is the greatest wealth. When you simplify, you begin to see people again, you listen with your whole body, you speak from your heart, you feel joy in giving, not possessing. In the clutter of modern life, love gets lost, but in simplicity, love shines. You love more deeply because you're more present, more real, more whole. And isn't that what we're truly after? Not more things, but more truth, more connection, more soul. Imagine 2 rooms, the first is packed, furniture, gadgets, decor, distractions. There's barely space to walk. the second is sparse, clean, with only what is needed, but with soft light, silence, space to breathe. Which room do you want to live in? Which one would allow you to sit, think, love, be? Simplicity is not the absence of life. It's the presence of clarity. In Buddhism, simplicity is woven into daily practice. Mindful consumption, only take what you need. Consume consciously, right livelihood, work in ways that don't harm others or your integrity. Voluntary simplicity. Let go of unnecessary possessions and commitments. Silent time each day, to return to your breath, your center, yourself. These aren't restrictions. They're liberations, like removing weights from your back so you can finally run freely. A curious student came to a Zen master, eager to learn. As the student rambled on, the master began pouring tea into his cup, and kept pouring even after it overflowed. Stop. It's spilling everywhere. The student cried. The master said calmly, like this cup, your mind is too full to receive anything new. Empty yourself. To live simply is to live like an empty cup, open, ready, receptive to life. There's another gift of simple living. It doesn't just heal the heart, it heals the earth. Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh once said, live simply, so that others, and future generations, may simply live. When you reduce consumption, you reduce harm. When you walk instead of rush, you leave lighter footprints. When you live with less, the planet breathes easier. Simplicity is an act of compassion, for yourself, for others, and for all beings. True fulfillment does not come from the outside in, it comes from the inside out. Simplicity reveals that peace is found in presence, happiness grows in contentment, love flourishes in stillness. When you no longer chase everything, you begin to cherish something, and that something, simple as it is, can feel like everything. So ask yourself gently, what can I let go of? What am I holding on to out of fear, not love? What matters most to me, really? Then make one small change today. Clear one drawer. Cancel one non-essential meeting. Spend one evening without screens. Breathe. It's not about doing everything, it's about starting with something. That's how simplicity begins, and fulfillment awakens. So here we are, the end of the journey, and yet, the beginning of a new way to live. Along the way, we've uncovered illusions, shed mental clutter, embraced stillness, and awakened gratitude. We've let go, so we could hold on to what truly matters. But now the question remains, how do we live this wisdom every day, not just in moments of reflection, but in traffic, at work, in line at the grocery store, when dishes pile up and emails won't stop? The answer is surprisingly simple, and yet, profoundly transformative. Walk gently, breathe deeply, smile often. In a world that rushes, be the one who slows down. Don't stomp through life, don't force your way forward, don't chase meaning so hard that you trample over it. To walk gently means to move through the world with presence and respect, for yourself, for others, and for the earth. Each step becomes a prayer, each footprint a reminder, I am here. I am alive. I choose peace. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh often spoke of walking meditation, where each step is taken as if kissing the earth. No need to be anywhere else, no need to prove anything, just this step. Just this breath. When life feels chaotic, your breath is your sanctuary. It is the bridge between your mind and body. It anchors you to the now, and the now, this very moment, is always enough. So breathe, not shallow, anxious gasps, but slow, nourishing, conscious breaths. Breathe like a tree drinks sunlight, breathe like the ocean takes in the moon. With each inhale, welcome life. With each exhale, let go of all that burdens you. In Buddhism, mindfulness begins with the breath. Why? Because everything begins with the breath, and in it, we rediscover simplicity, peace, and joy. No, not a fake smile, not a mask, a real smile, one born from a deep sense of contentment. You don't need the perfect life to smile. You just need to be aware of the miracle of living. Smile at the morning sun, smile at a bird on the windowsill, smile at the kindness in your own heart, even smile at your suffering, with compassion, not denial. The Buddha smiled. Not because life was easy, but because he saw clearly, and with clarity came peace. Thich Nhat Hanh used to say, Sometimes your joy is the source of your smile, but sometimes your smile can be the source of your joy. So try it, right now. Let your lips curl just slightly, feel your breath slow, feel your shoulders drop, feel the moment soften. That smile, it's your power, your practice, your offering to the world. What if you didn't need to change anything to be joyful? What if the life you've been searching for was already here, waiting beneath the noise? Joy doesn't need grand vacations or major accomplishments. It can be found in warm tea on a cold morning, in a bird's song at dawn, in the quiet presence of someone you love, in your own breath, steady and alive. This is what Buddhism teaches us. The conditions for happiness are already here. We just need to wake up to them. So as you return to your life, remember, you don't need to become a monk to live mindfully. You don't need to abandon your world, just your attachment to what doesn't serve you. In each ordinary moment, you can walk gently, breathe deeply, smile often. And in doing so, you transform the ordinary into the sacred. You make life a meditation. You make love a practice. You make joy a homecoming. Close your eyes, dear listener, take one slow breath, and hear these words, not from me, but from the silence inside you. You are enough. You have enough. This moment is enough. You don't need more, you only need to see clearly, and when you do, you'll realize that joy was never far away. It was in your footsteps, your breath, your smile, all along. Thank you for listening, for pausing, for remembering what truly matters. May this journey be a seed, may it grow in the soil of your awareness, and may it blossom into a life of quiet joy. Wherever you go, carry this with you. Live simply, love deeply, and smile. Like the Buddha, the path is beneath your feet. You are already home.